coming up.
Who directed you to open up a fund that was outside of the contribution agreements?
A violation of the law for a board member to receive funding to a company that they have an interest in from SDTC by virtue of the SDTC Act. So we're not only talking about conflicts of interest, but we're also talking about non-compliance with the SDTC Act.
Is the Auditor General's report about the massive amount of corruption and conflict of interest that went around by Liberal insiders being appointed and improving themselves tens of millions of dollars. I'm going to say, as opposed to the criticism you've heard around this table or through the Auditor General's report, I'm going to suggest that might be a very strong feature as to why the program is rightfully getting a lot of criticism.
That everyone has said, it's not my fault, we just let it go on. And as a deputy minister, I would think you would be appalled by the fact, regardless of who the past was, that a deputy minister would sit here and say, I didn't know anything. I spent absolutely no time overseeing, when I had an ADM in every meeting, that I spent no time, absolutely no time figuring out how they're doing it. It's beyond belief.
I don't know what it's comparable to. It makes the sponsorship scandal look small by comparison.
I know, I wasn't asking about an individual, but one would assume when an auditor went in and saw that over $200 million, or at least $100 million while she was on the board, went to companies that one director was gone, that might raise a flag and that somebody might have said something. But with that in mind, I would like to, Mr. Chair, move a motion if I could.
Sorry, Chair, I know that members of our team are asking if you're going to be bringing in dinner.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Karen Hogan, Auditor General Canada. Nice to see you and your team here today, along with Mathieu Lequin, Principal, and Eva Jarzina, Director. Lequin, je pense, plutôt. And from Sustainable Development Technology Canada, Paul Booth, Chair, Board of Directors. Thank you for joining us today, along with Cheryl Uri, Vice President, Finance. Mr. Perkins, we begin with you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. I think I'll begin my questioning with Ms. Uri. I'm going to start with a quick little summary. In 2019, the Prime Minister's handpicked chair for the SDTC, which the public knows as the Green Slush Fund, came in after SDTC had gotten a clean governance audit in 2017 from, I believe, both Treasury Board and the Auditor General. It seems to me like the culture of the organization changed quite a bit, and we've had testimony here that it changed too. The concept that Minister Baines and his office had said to manage conflicts. And so we have a number of directors who ended up doing transactions that end up, according to the Auditor General's report, almost half of all transactions from 2017 to 2023 were conflicted transactions out of the 420, which is quite an amazing thing, because I don't believe those directors represented more than half of the green technology sector. Yet somehow they managed to get almost half the funding when you combine the 90 that were undeclared conflicts, the 96 that were declared conflicts, and the $58 million of money spent outside the terms of the contribution agreement. And you were, I believe, the finance person all this time. And we had the deputy minister here last week, and he agreed that in a lot of cases, in some of these cases, the money should be paid back because it went in an inordinate number and outside to these directors and outside, in many cases, of the limit set out by Parliament to where it should be spent. Has the minister, the Liberal minister today of Industry, directed you, both the current acting chair and you as finance director, have they directed you to seek any of this money back?
Thank you for the question, and I would say, as you know, I think that we responded to the recommendations of the Auditor General. We accept the findings of the report. And
that in the statement. I have limited time. Please answer the question directly. Yes or no, have you been asked by the government to seek any of this money back or start the process for that? Yes or no?
Well, consistent with what Deputy Minister had said last week, we are looking at the projects within the portfolio to assess the criteria of eligibility, ensure the projects were eligible. Should we find any instances where projects are ineligible,
So that's a no.
we would work forward.
The government
to seek
hasn't asked you to
recovery.
seek the money back.
I believe that it was sought within the response to the Auditor General's report.
Well, I'm looking for you as the finance person to tell me whether the government has said that, not what the deputy said in his testimony. Has the government since then asked you to get the money back?
I believe the Deputy Minister would have been responding to the Auditor General's report where we said we would recover any funds that need to be recovered.
Responding to, I was here in the meeting, I wish you would answer the question. You are an officer of an organization that received $1 billion of taxpayer money. I will go on to my next question. One of the things that the Auditor General raised is this issue of these funds that are outside of the contribution agreement's legal limits. While you were CFO, the seed fund, as it's called, was set up. Who directed you to open up a fund that was outside of the contribution agreements?
So thank you for your question, and I would kind of direct you again to the response to the Auditor General's report. And
The Auditor General's report and response, it lays no clarity, doesn't say who ordered you and the management team to set up funds that were outside of the contribution agreement.
I would say, to my knowledge, there was no direction from within the department or from the Minister's office
So they
regarding
mythically
setting up
appeared
a
from the
seed fund.
board? Was it the board that did it, the hand-picked Liberal appointees? And the reason I ask is because you could not apply directly if you were a green technology fund to the seed fund. Is that correct? You couldn't apply to SDTC. You had to go through another body. What did SDTC call those other bodies that you had to apply for through to get money for the seed fund? What were they called?
So to understand our funding process, there's a requirement to always have a partner to be able to participate in your project.
I'm not looking for an explanation. The
And
funding
the partners within our seed funding stream, they'd be called accelerators,
They
and
were
they're distributed
accelerators.
across the
So
country.
the accelerators vetted the applications. You couldn't direct it. Now, the accelerators included the Fisherian Center, correct?
Correct.
And the Fisherian set up by the board.
Et donc cet organisme est dirigé par le président du Conseil. Et puis nous avons donc à Toronto.
Point of order. My apologies.
Yes, interpreters' apologies. Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you.
We will look to the French translation was coming through on the English. How are you hearing it right now? It's okay. Got it. That's why.
I tried to get their attention, but it didn't work.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Perkins, you've got just over 40 seconds left.
So the board chair's center had to vet the money, and it recommended companies that she had a financial interest in. Mars. Annette Fisherian chaired Mars. That was one of the accelerators that approved stuff, correct?
I would say that, yes, all
Yes,
accelerators
okay.
across the country, and the
Founder
seed
Fuel,
funding program began.
Founder Fuel was owned by, as an accelerator in Quebec, owned by another board member, André Lise-Matteau. Is that correct?
I'm not confident that that's an accelerator. I don't
It's
know.
on the accelerator list.
There's over 80, and I don't know the names of them all.
Well, it's here. I can assure you that for this fund, which almost all the funds appear to have gone to conflicted businesses outside of the government's terms of the use of this money, was filtered through these accelerators controlled by these two board members.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. We'll come back to you, I'm sure. Ms. Khalid.
So when we see conservative messaging of such programs being referred to as the Green Slush Fund or whatever it is, how do you think that impacts the credibility of an organization like that?
It's difficult for, I think, SDTC and its employees to hear that type of messaging delivered when we see some of the companies that have come through our portfolio and have been able to provide, I think, an incredible amount of jobs and contributed to environmental benefits across the country, and all Canadians are benefiting from this. And so for us, it's a bit of a challenge, for sure.
Thank you. And Mr. Booth, I'll just turn to you. What is your role now in this transitional board, and how do you see the organization going forward?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, my role is chair of the board, but this is a board of 3 equals, all former deputy ministers. You know, in terms of our priorities, we have 3 priorities. When I was a deputy minister, we told our ministers that they should only have 3 priorities. And so I think we have the right number. I mean, my priorities are implement the Auditor General's report, restart the funding, and plan and implement the transfer to the National Research Council. So we have divided the work among ourselves, and one of my colleagues will focus mostly on planning the transition. Another will focus mostly on the
Sorry, I'm just
did I
going to
say
pause
restart
you
the
right
funding?
there for a
oh
second.
yes, the transition. The other will do the restart the funding.
I pause for a quick second. Chair, I can literally hear my Conservative colleagues whispering so loud that I can't hear the witness. So if you can, please, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Ms. Hogan, I believe I heard you state that benefiting from public dollars is a conflict of interest. Is that correct?
I think that's a fundamental rule, that if you're involved in a public organization, you should not be seen to be personally benefiting from public funds.
Would that include your family?
So I think it depends how you're going to frame it. Every case is a case that needs to be evaluated on its own merit.
In your overall findings, you found that the foundation poorly managed conflicts of interest, where the foundation's records showed the conflict of interest policies were not followed in 90 cases. Specifically, you identified the spouse of one of the foundation's senior managers was a partner at a human resources firm that was recruiting that the foundation used to support its process to appoint directors. The senior manager declared a perceived conflict of interest to the then CEO, and the board was only made aware of the perceived conflict of interest, as I'd understand, about a year later, despite the situation relating to board appointments. So to be clear and on the record, does that framing to you capture the current acting CEO, Zaid Ram's hiring of his own wife to recruit board members that subsequently gave Mr. Zaid his bonuses and also selected him as the acting CEO after the previous CEO resigned? Is that accurate?
So if I may, Mr. Chair, there's just one clarity I'd like to provide. The 90 cases were not linked to this. The example that the member is talking about are cases that we highlighted where there are other instances.
To the hiring of his wife, who would then be responsible for appointing the directors, who would then be responsible for his oversight.
So I'm getting to those where other instances that we felt the conflict of interest policy for the foundation just did not address. In our view, this is a risk. While it wasn't directly linked to funding, it was definitely a conflict of interest that should have been declared, and the board should have been made aware of it sooner. Yes.
In all the projects that you reviewed, did you find any funding applications that were approved without having the appropriate supporting documentation, such as project details, milestones, or completed budget?
When we concluded that there were 10 projects that were ineligible, 2 were clearly the seed funding because we felt it did not comply at all with the contribution agreement. But the remaining 8 were cases where the file just didn't support why these projects were eligible. So, you know, without that evidence there, it's difficult for us to conclude that they were eligible.
And were you able to cross-reference those files with the files that were identified through having potential conflicts of interest?
We did, and I know that there, I believe, is 2 where there's a crossover. It's actually quite complicated. There are the conflicts of interest crossover, double up in instances, but there were definitely at least 2 projects that we deemed were ineligible that were cases where a conflict of interest had been declared and a person continued to vote.
Thank you. Did you come across instances where the board bulk approved a set of project applications without proper documentation being presented or reviewed by the board?
So I think I would describe two instances there, which we believe do not follow the contribution agreement. The contribution agreement is clear that funding should always be given based on merit project by project. So it would have been the seed stream of projects and then the COVID payments where it was a batch approval that we believe should not have been done that way. It violated the contribution agreement between the government
Certainly,
and the
Ms. Yuri would recall, I sat on the cross-examination, I think, that ultimately discovered that the chair of the board was receiving COVID payments, hadn't recused himself, has since stepped down. Is it also safe to say that in these instances that were bulk approved without proper documentation, that there was also an overlap with the conflict of interest that you identified in the cases?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was about 60 some odd cases, 63, I'm going to look for the number, 63 cases of COVID payments that were in conflict of interest. And then later on that the way the COVID payments were approved did not follow the contribution agreement. So there's two things at play with those payments.
And not coming into, like the contribution agreement would also trigger things like financial compliance. Is that correct?
The contribution agreement between the federal government and the foundation really sets out how they should determine eligibility. And
It's just if I could, I only have a minute left. There would have to be a need, correct?
they would have to demonstrate that it's a new technology
Right.
that is innovative, and that there would be environmental benefits that were tangible to the Canadian population.
Did you come across any cases where executives brought forward board-related projects that had been rejected by reviewers on multiple occasions, yet still moved forward for a second or third time with a new reviewer?
If you permit me, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to ask Mathieu to answer that.
If he could in a yes or no, if he knows, yes, if he doesn't, yes, okay. Are you confident then, knowing this, knowing all the conflicts, knowing all the ways in which bulk approvals happen at the board level, conflicted with board members, are you confident that all applications were treated fairly and evaluations and approval processes were consistent across all applications?
So I guess it comes back to how we did our sampling. We did a statistical sample because we couldn't sample all projects that were available. We looked at those in the allegations, and those are separate. But in our statistical sample, we felt that there was enough errors that meant at least 1 in 10 projects in the streams that remain are likely also ineligible, which is why we made the recommendation that it isn't just the 10 we found. You need to do more work to determine if there are others.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Beginning our second round, Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Yuri, can you confirm that SDTC is abiding by the order of the House of Commons and turning over all of its records to the RCMP?
So my understanding is SDTC did receive an order from the House of Commons, and we're in the process of collecting the documents that have been required and requires
Documents will be turned over within 30 days of that order, correct?
The intention is to turn over the plan is to turn over all the documents to the law clerk as has been requested.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, you found in your damning report $76 million that went out the door, in which board members at SDTC sat on, deliberated on, voted on the funneling out the door of those monies to companies that they had an interest in blatant conflicts of interest, blatant corruption. You provided this committee with a list of the board members and the companies that received those monies. One board member, Andre Lise-Mateau, who is a former colleague and longstanding friend of the Minister of the Environment, Mr. Guilbeault, received over $50 million, her companies, in funding from SDTC while she sat on the board, but she voted on. I have identified a number of other companies that Ms. Mateau has an interest in that received monies from SDTC while Ms. Mateau served on the board. So I want to ask you, did you look into the funding received by MindSense Technologies Limited, which received $4 million from SDTC, in which Ms. Matteau is an investor?
So, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure I can respond at that granular level. I'll see if the team can do some research. I think it's important to know that we didn't target board members or their companies. We looked at the process that the foundation had in place, and at times there were conflicts of interest that were well managed, and we highlighted the 90 that were not.
Well, Ms. Hogan, I would note that it is a blatant conflict of interest to, as you determined, to sit in a meeting and approve funding to a company that you have an interest in, and there were at least more than $50 million that went out the door that you've identified with respect to Ms. Matteau. And not only that, but it is a violation of the law for a board member to receive funding to a company that they have an interest in from SDTC by virtue of the SDTC Act. So we're not only talking about conflicts of interest, but we're also talking about non-compliance with the SDTC Act. So I would just, for the record, ask you to come back to this committee and determine whether you factored in or considered, with respect to conflicts of interest and non-compliance with the law by Ms. Matteau, not only $4 million that went to MindSense Technologies, but $7.1 million. In fact, maybe what I'll do is just get back to you with a list. Would you undertake to do that? Because when you calculated it, there's millions and millions of dollars more that went out the door.
Mr. Chair, the team will have to go back through the lots of details in our file in order to be able to answer that question, and we'll see what we can provide to the committee.
Turn it over to Mr. Perkins.
You got about 50 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to go back and ask a question on the issue of whether or not those companies, and I'll ask this to you, Mr. Booth, those companies that the Auditor General has determined were done under a conflict of interest. Well, actually, I'll start with the first group. There was $58 million that went to companies, according to the Auditor General, that were ineligible. They were outside of the parameters of the contribution agreements. Will you commit that no company will get further funding going forward in its new structure that is part of that group or any other group that was received money that is outside of the existing contribution agreements, as has happened under Annette Pasharian's chairmanship and these other Liberal appointees?
Mr. Chair, I have to admit, on the 13th day on the job, I'm not familiar with the details of the companies or the.
I'm sorry, Mr. Booth, but I wasn't asking for the particular companies. It's a general statement.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is my commitment, consistent with the Auditor General's report, is to go back and review all the companies that have received funding to make sure that it was appropriate, and in the cases where it was not appropriate, as identified by the Auditor General, to see what are the appropriate steps. So my commitment to you is that we will review all of the companies that receive funding, and as my colleague said, we'll start with the companies that have projects in process. So for the ones that have no problems, we can get that funding restarted. But my plan is, with my fellow board members, to review all the projects that have been funded.
Thank you very much.
Some of the overriding themes that your office often looks at right, where it's a lack of documentation, whether deliberate or not deliberate, or governance structures that are not properly put in place. But I understand it's unusual because this is an arm's length organization. Typically, your office would be auditing government departments and crown corporations. Can you just talk to us about the nature of the structure of this organization? What were the challenges for your office, if any, in doing the audit, and in particular that it's tied to a federal department, but is it, what did those ties look like? I'm also curious about what the oversight function was. What did you observe about that? Was there some kind of a regular check-in? I'm trying to get a good understanding of as to how SDTC operated in its early years.
Okay, there were many questions in there, and I'll try and answer them all. So, as you said, a foundation is another arm's length away from a crown corporation from the federal government. So that in and itself usually would make it ineligible for my office to audit. We are not the auditors of the foundation. The reason we could go to the foundation is that it is funded solely by federal money, and it's that contribution agreement that existed between the Government of Canada and the foundation that gave me the conduit to go in and see whether or not public funds were spent in a prudent way. The ties to the department is that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada had oversight responsibility, or responsibility to monitor, I guess is the best way to describe it, compliance with that contribution agreement. And that compliance structure was actually set out in the contribution agreement. It wasn't just about receiving corporate plans, which they did receive, minutes, which they did receive, but that they should have been auditing compliance with the contribution agreement to make sure that public funds were being used in a prudent way. You asked about things that were unusual. I would tell you that relationship is an unusual one. It's usually quite unusual for a department to be so involved with an arm's length, even further arm's length organization than a crown. But I would tell you that the corporate structure set up in the Sustainable Development Technology Act is an unusual one. The one where there is not only a board of directors, but a group of members that is meant to be self-sustaining and to appoint the members. So that is an unusual corporate structure, and we found that there was challenges in it being, in the act being respected. In fact, that was one of our findings, in that the board of directors of the foundation didn't ensure that the foundation continued to comply with aspects of their enabling legislation. So I think that I've covered off all of your elements, hopefully.
Mr. Green, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put two questions to you, Ms. Yuri, that are going to be yes or no questions. The first question is, does the contribution agreement require SDTC to transparently provide the public with its application criteria and funding streams so that anyone in the public can apply for funding?
Yes, that is an element of the.
Did SDTC provide the public with any information or opportunity to apply for the funding through the Ecosystem Fund?
Not that I'm aware of.
Then how was the board chair of Versations Center selected for funding review in a fair manner if the public never had information about the fund's existence?
My understanding is the ecosystem stream was a pilot, and there was no. It was a stream to be able to understand if there was an appetite or
who
whether
created
there
the
was an ability.
pilot?
I believe it was an initiative of the former CEO.
The CEO created a pilot that
No,
fast-tracked its own
No.
project
The
through...
ecosystem stream
Correct.
was to look for projects in that was an initiative of our former CEO.
Similarly, then, how was the CEO's Alice project selected for funding review in a fair manner if the public never had any information that these funds existed?
My understanding is the Alice project was referred to SDTC by Emissions Reduction Alberta, so it was from another funding agency.
Another funding agency presented it to SDTC for selection?
Correct.
Who selected it?
I don't know that.
You don't know?
I don't know the answer to that question. The ecosystem stream was very much a pilot. It was an attempt to see if there were projects that could fit what SDTC was delivering and providing greater benefits, environmental benefits to the
But that's not the question. The
ecosystem.
question I asked is, did the public have an opportunity for a fair procurement process or a fair application process for public funds, or were these hand-selected with clear conflicts of interest to board members and people associated in senior management?
Again, I can only tell you it was a pilot.
Ms.
stream,
Hogan,
just the two.
based on what you've just heard as a characterization, is it fair to say that STTC executives were giving preferential treatment in hand-selecting companies that were not eligible and broke the conflict of interest because they were connected to management and the board, while simultaneously none of these opportunities were presented to the general public?
Mr. Chair, what I can tell you about the ecosystem is what we wrote in paragraph 63 in our report, is that we found that innovation, science, and economic development had raised concerns with management that the ecosystems projects did not meet the contribution agreement, but we saw no evidence that management at the foundation had talked to the board about this. So I think there was a breakdown in communication here about things that really were not eligible to be funded under the contribution.
But to be clear, the board chair's name was literally on the center receiving funding, correct?
I don't believe that that organization received funding. There were two organizations
Oh,
who
that's
received
right.
ecosystem funding.
Thank you.
My apologies. They tried to find them other funding somewhere else.
Thank you, Mr. Green. We'll certainly come back to you. Mr. Duncan, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Uri, I want to follow up. Earlier on in some of the lob questions back and forth from the Liberal side, you had said that this seed funding program you deemed to be very successful, a great success. And one of the frustrations about the program was the criticism it's been receiving. I find that a little, frankly, tone deaf after the reason we're here is the Auditor General's report about the massive amount of corruption and conflict of interest that went around by Liberal insiders being appointed and improving themselves tens of millions of dollars. I'm going to say, as opposed to the criticism you've heard around this table or through the Auditor General's report, I'm going to suggest that might be a very strong feature as to why the program is rightfully getting a lot of criticism. But I want to follow up to what Mr. Perkins said earlier, asking about getting taxpayers' money returned from these projects that were deemed ineligible. You mentioned, we haven't done it yet. The government hasn't reached out. We haven't reached out to anybody to get any money back yet because you're evaluating it. There are 10 projects, for an example, that the Auditor General said worth $59 million that were not they were ineligible. They were not eligible for this money. What more do you need to study before asking them for the money back?
I think we need to develop a process to be enabled us to determine how to recover those funds and what the most appropriate mechanism is. And that's where we're looking at a path forward in assessing the eligibility of all the portfolio and moving forward with a consistent path forward so all of the companies are treated fairly.
And I'll go back, Mr. Booth. I want to ask you about this because not only were there the 10 projects worth $59 million deemed ineligible, there's the number of 90 cases, more than that, $76 million alone, where there was conflicts of interest that the Auditor General had highlighted in the selected area of review. In your opinion, in your job asking you to come in and clean up this corruption, if a board of directors member or there was a conflict of interest and money was approved, do you agree that that automatically makes them ineligible and that money should be returned by taxpayers?
Mr. Chair, I would say that, as I said before, I'm going to review with my two fellow board members all the projects and in any cases where money should be recovered.
So my question specifically, Mr. Booth, is in the case if there's a conflict of interest on the project where money was granted, is that ineligible and the money must come back to taxpayers? On conflict of interest, the Auditor General has selected a number. Yes or no? Does the money come back?
I will assess the projects, and when I believe money should be recovered, if it can be recovered, I will recover it.
Well, I was going to say that the cleanup that's going to be required here might be a bit more of a light dusting if you can't commit that the Auditor General says that conflict of interest rules were not followed and was not appropriate. I'm just going to read right from the Act. I know you're new on the job in the last couple of weeks, but it's the seriousness and just actually, frankly, the simplicity of it, where the Act does state for conflict of interest. It says, for the purposes of this Act, a public office holder is in a conflict of interest when he or she exercises an official power, duty, or function that provides an opportunity to further his or her private interest or those of his or her relatives or friends. Decision-making, no public office holder shall make a decision or participate in making a decision related to the exercise of an official power, and can go on in many other parts that it's in an act in the Parliament of Canada. And you can't tell me, just at a high level, I'm not giving a name or a number, but if somebody was found to have violated the Act and violated the conflict of interest rules, the Auditor General says there's at least 90 cases with $76 million. Do you not think Canadians might be frustrated in the work you're asked to come in and do and clean up? You can't even tell me that if you're in a conflict of interest, you knew the rules, you broke the rules and got the money, that money needs to come back for taxpayers. I'll ask you again, if they're in conflict of interest, they broke the rules of the Act, will that money be forced to come back to taxpayers?
As a deputy minister, one of the things I learned was not to give blanket assurances without a complete understanding of the facts. And I'm going to have to go. I completely accept the report of the Auditor General, and my main responsibility will be to implement her report. But to give any assurances about any companies before I understand the facts would be ill-advised, and I will not do it.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan, that is your time.
Just given some of the blatant conflict of interests that have been revealed here through the Auditor General's report, and we've been able to dive into a little bit more today, I was just hoping you could walk me through the process of how the ISED was reviewing the minutes to ensure that there is an oversight mechanism. And I'm just kind of curious how some of these cases were not identified up until this Auditor General's report.
So thank you for the question. I can tell you that for every board meeting, the department has provided all of the documents related to that board meeting. They also have accessible to them the documents for any of the committee meetings as well. And so ISED has provided these in advance of the meeting, so they would have the ability to review the materials provided as well as the minutes of the previous meeting, because that would be contained in those materials. I'm not don't work within the department, so I'd be unable to kind of respond to how they review them within the department, other than knowing that SDTC's board meetings regularly had a departmental representative observing at the meetings, not necessarily a participant, but generally there as an observer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll pick up there with you, Mr. Booth. You were a Deputy Minister of Finance. You've got a distinguished career in the public service. SDTC had an ADM in every board meeting, every single board meeting that happened. Half of the transactions that those boards passed were conflicted. Half. Do you believe that ADM reporting to you would never tell you as the Deputy Minister that half of an $800 million fund of taxpayer money was being voted to the directors themselves, that he would never tell the deputy about that?
Mr. Chair, it's very difficult for me to say what the assistant deputy minister knew and what he reported to the deputy minister. I honestly don't know. But one of the things I will say is this goes back to what I just said about the legislation. This is an arm's-length body.
Sorry, Mr. Booth. I didn't ask you about the legislation because there was not a single chair of this board since its establishment in 2001 that had a conflict. Not one, until Annette Basharian. And she was appointed over the objections of the senior management team who told the ADM, the deputy minister, and the minister's office that they shouldn't appoint a board member who's conflicted, yet they did. So it boggles my mind that we've had ministers here claiming, like Navdeep Bains doing his Sergeant Schultz routine, that he knew nothing. He doesn't remember anything. All he's responsible was for appointing corrupt Liberals to the board. He wasn't responsible for overseeing the corrupt Liberals to the board. Like, it's appalling to me that everyone has said, it's not my fault. We just let it go on. And as a deputy minister, I would think you would be appalled by the fact, regardless of who the past was, that a deputy minister would sit here and say, I didn't know anything. I spent absolutely no time overseeing, when I had an ADM in every meeting, that I spent no time, absolutely no time figuring out how they're doing it. It's beyond belief that an ADM sitting in every single one of these board meetings, unless it's because he was asking one of the previous chairs for a job outside of government, maybe he was conflicted. But it's incredible to think that we're going to get the same old stuff, the same old management, the same old approach, the same old whatever. Okay, they were legitimate companies and everyone's conflicted and everyone in this industry is conflicted. Half of all the transactions in the audit period had a problem. Half. So there's absolutely no way these 4 directors that did this are in control of all the companies in the entire green technology industry. It just happened that the half that they had an interest in managed to get through the system. Come on. It's a conspiracy of corruption and defrauding the taxpayer. And nobody in the government seems to care. No current minister, no current deputy minister, and you as a former deputy minister of finance don't seem to care, yet they put you in charge.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, is there a question?
Why are you not appalled by this? Surely in 2 weeks you've had the opportunity to look at some of this stuff in preparation for appearing today.
In preparation for my appearance today, I did quite a lot of things in the past 2 weeks, and I prepared a list. I don't think the minister, the honourable member is asking that. I spent most of my time becoming familiar with the Auditor General's report. I haven't looked at any individual files yet, and I'm not ready to do that. But the one assurance that I will give you is that I will implement the Auditor General's report and to the best of my ability, and make sure that no funding goes forward that isn't compliant.
Okay, I appreciate that. The Auditor General, there's a fellow named Chris Wormold, and he was the business review analyst for this outside consultants. And he put forward reports, and we have copies of them, that said a number of these projects should not be approved and shouldn't be qualified under the funds. And then only within a couple of months, he put forward a report saying, oh, sorry, changed my mind. These should be approved. It happens that the ones that he changed his mind on were all financially owned by one of the directors. Did you, as the Auditor General, as part of the governance and analysts, understand and look in that depth at this fellow, Chris Wormold, and all of those things that were off the table and rejected, and then back on the table mysteriously, happen to be the ones the directors owned?
As I mentioned before, we don't look at the individual actions of a person. We went to the organization, but I believe that the honourable member is talking about a reference in paragraph 42, where we did highlight that there was an external expert who had a conflict and wasn't removed. Again, this is instances where the conflict of interest policy it didn't cover things or wasn't followed. And so I believe that we highlighted a couple of those situations in paragraph 42.
Thank you.
I can ask Mathieu to add if you would like more details. I don't know.
Go ahead.
In our sample, the companies that have been reviewed by this individual were in a sample, so we have review, but we did not expand the work with this person in our head. So we looked at what it was in a sample. The 2 companies you're talking about were in a sample, so this is how we picked up the situation.
Are you involved in the employee transfers from SDTC to the NRC?
I'm not sure what you mean, am I involved? I mean, as chair of the board, I will be involved, although I'm not leading the planning on the transfer of programming and staff to the NRC. That's one of my board colleagues.
Okay. Can you talk about how these transfers are happening, the number of employees that are being transferred over?
Well, first of all, SDTC is a pretty small organization in terms of staff. I think in the neighborhood of 75. So relatively small compared to the National Research Council. My sense is, I mean, the minister has already said that all the staff from SDTC will be offered employment at the NRC, but of course it remains to be seen. And in fact, I mean, this is one of the things that I've been thinking about. There's a lot of expertise there, and the folks in the NRC in our preliminary meeting recognize that. So, you know, one of the things that we're going to have to do is try to make sure that we don't have a big loss of expertise as the programming moves over to the council.
Does the contribution agreement require SDTC to review financial compliance and fully complete a project budget for an approval?
Yes, it does.
Would SDTC executives recommend a project to the board if there were concerns of financial noncompliance and incomplete budgets?
I don't believe so.
Why then were the financial concerns of noncompliance relating to the ALIS ecosystem ignored?
I don't believe that there were concerns around financial noncompliance with the ALIS ecosystem project. ALIS had proposed a project to help remediate the soil.
What about more broadly with ecosystems? Did you ever have any concerns about financial noncompliance with the ecosystem projects?
Anytime that there is a concern around financial compliance, it's ensuring that we're funding an appropriate project budget.
Ms. Yuri, I'm going to reference to you an email that you sent to Christine Charbonneau dated February 24th, 2022. In it, you said, subject line DD number 4, February 22nd, question. Hi there. Attached is a summary of the expenses that are planned for the ecosystem project that is being proposed for potentially 2022B. You may recall this. You said it is a challenge to ensure compliance as there is no clear project identified. Do you recall that email?
And that's, I was about to respond, and so the concern with all projects is ensuring that we have a project that's clearly defined. And so I had expressed my concerns around the ALIS project and that we need to ensure that we have an appropriate budget for the project and understand those costs. That
At any time, did you ever have SDT staff working to ensure that there were appropriate budgets and compliances for companies that had applied that didn't meet that standard?
Every budget is reviewed that comes into the organization.
Is it common to have staff within SDTC work proactively for an organization to help create budgets and compliance?
I don't believe that SDTC creates budgets for
So that's never happened? You've never had staff work on a project to help bring somebody into compliance? Is that what your testimony today?
No. So what happens with budgets that come into the organization is budgets are received from the companies. The budgets are reviewed, and part of that review is to ensure that the companies understand the eligibility requirements of the fund. We don't want budgets coming in that have ineligible costs.
Is it common practice to have staff work on proactively, after the case, after the approval, retroactively, I should say, compliance? It's just a simple question, yes or no. Is it common to have them work on projects?
If there's budgets that have, or if there's reporting that comes back from companies that is not within our eligible cost buckets and is not clearly within the scope of the project, then yes, we would have, as part of our review process, we would be informing the company that they need to.
And then you would have your staff work on it?
There would be, within our finance organization, folks that would address those issues.
Ms. Yuri, why did the SDC board and executive team approve the ALIS ecosystem and give them $5 million in tax-paying money when it was conflicted with the CEO, it was ineligible, had no budget or compliance, and especially when other companies never give this type of preferential treatment?
So my understanding for the ALIS project was that any conflicts that were associated with that project were declared, adjudicated and a decision was made on who could participate in those votes.
This is, granted, we've already established this is a special fund for which no public advertising or opportunity was given to people outside of those that were insiders and connected to board members. So have you ever, as an executive, knowingly ignored financial noncompliance for companies that successfully received money?
No, I've never ignored financial noncompliance. All projects require a budget and eligible expense review, and that's prior to any funds being dispersed.
So Section 671 of the auditor's report identifies that COVID-19 dollars were paid out without ensuring that there was a process to award such payments complied with contribution agreements. What would the risk would the recipient companies be in if they were in breach of their contribution agreements?
So prior to, I think, providing any type of COVID support, there was a review of all the companies.
Did you ever knowingly provide COVID support to companies you knew would automatically be in breach of financial compliance, i.e. be overfunded? Did you ever do that?
There was I can tell you for the assessment process that I was involved in, there was a review of funding ratios of the companies.
75% is the appropriate ratio?
It will 50% for the SDTC funding ratio and 75% for the company.
Were there companies that ever came in at 78%?
If there was any company. So what happens with our funding is there's always a holdback. So each disbursement that's provided, there's 10% that's
Did the
withheld.
companies know that in receiving the
Thank
COVID
you. I'm
funding,
afraid
they
that
would be
is
in
your
breach of their
time,
agreements?
Mr. Green. I'll allow a quick response from Ms. Yuri.
As far as I was aware, that we wouldn't have been providing funding to companies that would have put them in breach of their funding ratios.
Thank you.
Ms. Hogan, are you satisfied with responses from SDTC and the department about how they are dealing with ineligible projects?
The organizations agreed with my recommendation, and I think I've been clear in the past about if there is any funding that has been given to an individual or organization that is ineligible, I would expect that the government will take action to recover that. And if they do not plan to do so, I would expect them to be clear and transparent with Canadians about why.
You're not fully satisfied.
Well, I haven't seen them take any action yet, but they've agreed
well,
with my recommendation, so it'll be time to see, time will tell how they implement the recommendation.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Ms. Yuri, in the last fiscal year, how much did SDTC board members and the chair receive in bonuses?
In the last fiscal year, board members don't receive bonuses. How much
did the CEO receive? How much did executive members receive in the way of bonuses?
This past fiscal year, no bonuses have been paid to executive team.
This is okay. In 2021, it was confirmed that the CEO received bonuses in the amount of $96,000. VPs received bonuses of $48,000. I'm talking about for each VP, and each board member. You said board members don't receive bonuses. They received $11,000 in bonuses. Each and every board member. We're talking about that's hundreds of thousands of dollars in bonuses. Can you confirm that bonuses were awarded on the basis of meeting funding goals? In other words, getting money out the door.
The performance, pay for performance framework that we follow at SDTC is linked to corporate performance, which starts with the corporate plan. And so objectives are set for the year within the corporate plan.
That would include getting money out the door, correct?
There are a number of initiatives, including
supporting ecosystem.
I
asked if that was one of the criteria, yes or no. And you know the answer to that, and the answer is yes, but I'm going to put it to you to put that on the record.
But yes, disbursements to companies that have been approved are one of the targets for the year.
That's right. And so what we have is $319 million that were funneled by board members to companies that they had an interest in, which violated the law, which were blatant conflicts of interest, outright corruption, so that they in turn could meet bonus eligibility criteria, so that, guess what, they could pad their pockets with even more money. Now, I would characterize that as an absolute racket. It is corruption on a scale that I don't know what it's comparable to. It makes the sponsorship scandal look small by comparison. And Ms. Uri, you signed off on the checks, right? You were Vice President of Finance at the time. You are now.
I wasn't Vice President of Finance at the time. I've been Vice President of Finance for about 18 months.
Were you You were CFO?
No, I was an employee of the organization.
In finance?
Some of the time in finance, yes.
I want to ask you about Cycle Capital. SDTC has funded Cycle Capital. It's received somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million to Cycle Capital. This is a company that Minister Guilbeault is a major shareholder in. He had also worked as a lobbyist for Cycle Capital. It happens to be, the managing partner happens to be none other than Andre Lise.
I'll need a question, Mr. Cooper, please.
Marteau. Do you think of $17 million went out the door to Cycle Capital while Minister Guilbeault served in cabinet? Did anyone at SDTC think that maybe that wasn't a good idea? Maybe that might be problematic, that a company that the Minister of the Environment had an interest in was receiving $17 million in funding from SDTC?
All I can tell you regarding that is SDTC has never provided funding to Cycle Capital. It's not a company that SDTC provides funding
to its companies.
Gentlemen, that is the time. Thank you for that response. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to direct my questions to the new witnesses regarding the transitional process. Mr. Booth, as a transitional board member, what does your role look like? And are you intending or expecting to be part of the leadership or executive once the transition of SDTC to NRC has been completed?
Mr. Chair, I don't know if it's appropriate to reveal this, but I am 70 years old, and my term is for 1 year, and I'm kind of hoping that we can complete this task in less than a year, and that will end my involvement with this process. So I have no intention or interest in an ongoing role with STTC or the NRC. And in fact, I think if I understand correctly the process that we will have to follow, the last thing I will do is apply to dissolve the foundation.
Okay, that kind of leads me to my next question. Could you outline the timeline and key milestones for the transition of SDTC operations to the NRC? And what role will the transitional board play in overseeing the process? And again, how exactly will the SDTC employees be integrated into the NRC structure?
Mr. Chair, I have to say that the answers to those questions are all at the end of the planning process, not at the beginning, the planning process that we're just embarking on. I mean, I've told you that we have divided the work among the three directors, and the two that aren't here visiting with the committee are actually in Ottawa trying to advance that work. And so the planning of the transition on the SDTC side is internal planning is starting today in the SDTC offices, and the plan is to start the preliminary meetings with the National Research Council next week. But as far as concrete timelines in terms of what time or when employees will transfer, all I can say is my plan is that will be in a year or less. And from my point of view, the sooner the better.
Ms. Yuri, as the Vice President of Finance, how will your role as a board member change throughout this transition?
I believe that my role in the transition is very much to help support the work that we need to do to be able to prepare the organization, to be able to have a seamless transition into the National Research Council. I'm here to essentially I think, provide guidance to staff to help them through the process, as well as ensuring that we're kind of following an appropriate transition budget and make the move as smooth as possible. More importantly, during this time is to try to get our disbursements to our active portfolio of companies back up and running. And so that includes the work around assessing eligibility of projects and ensuring that we're still supporting the companies within the portfolio.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Mr. Booth. How will the transition contribute to enhancing the accountability and transparency in funding and support for clean technology initiatives?
Well, I think in two ways. First of all, even though we're working to transition programming and funding to the NRC, we're still implementing the Auditor General's report. So, strengthened record keeping, strengthened conflict of interest processes, all of those things will travel with the programming to the NRC. Now, they'll have to be modified because they'll land in a government department, which is a different structure. But I think a lot of them can be used because we're still going to have to access expert advice. Conflict of interest has to be managed there, and the other thing is the future staff, the NRC staff that work on SDTC funding or clean tech funding will still have to be mindful and careful in managing potential perceived or real conflicts that they have. So, I think that going to a government department will help accountability, and I've already talked about that, but also the work that we're doing to implement the Auditor General's report will help the NRC do a good job of clean tech funding in the future.
And given the emphasis on rebuilding public trust and enhancing accountability, which has been damaged, what measures are being put in place to communicate these improvements effectively to stakeholders and the general public?
Perkins, Cooper.
I don't
Who's next?
I don't have an answer for that yet. Right now, we're focusing on communications with staff because this is a big change for them. But the next step is to talk with stakeholders. Stakeholders are very anxious, obviously, and I'll be honest, I haven't turned my mind to communication with the public. As a deputy minister, my thought was always that was the job of ministers to do that and not public servants. But this is a new role I'm in, and I'll certainly add that to my list of things to ponder.
Thank you very much. That is the time. And pardon me, I had a mic open there when I asked a sidebar question. Beginning our last round, Mr. Perkins, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Uri, I'd like to follow up on the question on bonuses. So you said none were paid this year. Were any bonuses paid the year before, last year? So that would be 2022.
In the previous fiscal year, yes, bonuses.
And how much were they?
I believe it's actually available, publicly available in the annual report that's on
Okay.
our website, and so it would vary depending on the level
Okay,
of the employee.
can you table with this committee during the period of the time of the audit, 2017 through 2023, the bonuses paid to each individual executive, as well as any other additional compensation in that period of time they may have been given besides performance pay?
We should be able to table that without problem.
Thank you. Auditor General, I know your audit only went back to 2017. I would have been happy if it went back further, but I just want to outline to you why, and there was a mention earlier about Cycle Capital, and they don't pay. They don't pay Cycle Capital. Cycle Capital is a venture capital firm and owns a lot of companies, has ownership in a lot of companies. And if we go back to the establishment of Cycle Capital in 2009, and including your report, the companies that they are listed to have ownership in got $213 million, a considerable amount of the $1 billion Green Slush Fund. And after receiving the first $100 million, their founder owner was appointed to the board in 2016 as already having companies she had invested in having $100 million. The appointments process seems to be very flawed when somebody whose investments had already received $100 million was seen as a reasonable director for this board. Wouldn't you agree?
I can't comment on how board members were appointed. I didn't look at that during our audit.
But you don't think it's a problem that somebody gets appointed to a board her companies have received $100 million from the very board that she's being appointed to?
So as I mentioned, I think the Sustainable Development Technology Act had this inherent conflict of interest just baked into it. I would have expected that that would have been factored into an appointment process, and that if conflict of interest existed, whether the real or perceived, that they would have been better managed than what we found.
Look, it's very clear in the Act, both the SDTC Act and both the Conflict of Interest Act for public office holders, that you're not to benefit directly, you or your family, from the work of the organization as a public office holder you've been appointed to. And while given the list that you gave, and this is only what I've been able to find, the list that you gave us after the last meeting combined with the work I had done, there's $105 million that went to Cycle Capital alone during the time Cycle Capital's companies, during the time she was on the board from 2016 to 2023. Your audit's 2017 to 2023. It seems to have missed quite a bit of the conflicted companies that she got money to.
It's my understanding that the individual in question left the board, I think, earlier in 2020, 21. I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, when we approached this, we weren't looking at targeting individuals. We went in to see the process that the foundation had in place, and we found significant lapses.
I know, I wasn't asking about an individual, but one would assume when an auditor went in and saw that over $200 million, or at least $100 million while she was on the board, went to companies that one director was gone. That might raise a flag, and that somebody might have said something. But with that in mind, I would like to, Mr. Chair, move a motion if I could.
Give all your time to
NDP? I already did that earlier, Martin. I already did that.
Just one second, Mr. Perkins, before you begin, and you do have the floor. Could I ask you, have you sent the motion to the?
It's been sent.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
So I have forwarded the motion to the clerk to distribute to members. Given the Auditor General's audit of Sustainable Development and Technology Canada, and given the government-appointed board members approved, A, $59 million towards 10 ineligible projects, B, $76 million towards 90 projects in which board members had conflicts of interest and violated internal conflict of interest policies. I would add to that, and the SDTC Act. $259 million towards 96 projects where board members held conflicts of interest. D, $58 million towards projects without ensuring the contribution agreement terms were met. The committee therefore expressed extreme concern with the blatant disregard of taxpayer funds and therefore calls on the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry to recoup these funds for Canadian taxpayers within 100 days following the adoption of this motion, that the committee report this matter to the House.
Mr. Perkins, just 1 second. You'll be able to speak to this. When you were reading that out, you said, and I would add, and you added a few words. Were those words in the motion you sent to the clerk?
We can...
Well, I need, once it's sent, the motion is out there, so...
Well, however you want to do it, I would
like you to tell me right now if you added a few words verbally that you would like added to the motion that was sent to the clerk.
In B, in violation of internal conflict of interest policies is how it reads now, and I would say, and in violation of the SDTC Act.
Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Just on that, perhaps we should suspend so that we can all have clear
I'm going to do that.
language.
That was my next step, was to get it to you before we speak to it. So, but I wanted to clarify it because he said one thing, and I believed he had sent something else in. So just give me a second, and we'll get this sorted out. I will suspend for a minute. The motion has been circulated, and well, Mr. Perkins, I'm not worried about you. It's your motion. It will come very quickly, and you have the floor, please. Very good.
I don't want to prolong the evening, so in terms of the motion, I think the motion is self-evident. We've had a lot of discussion over a number of meetings. The Auditor General's report is very clear that there's almost half the transactions in that 5-year period were conflicted. It's clearly a clear conspiracy, which is why it's being turned over to the RCMP, conspiracy to commit fraud on the taxpayer for the personal benefit of board members. So the items of the 186 conflicted, the 10 that were clearly outside that the Auditor General, to me, that money needs to be repaid. It's an abuse of the taxpayer for personal benefit of Liberal insiders. And that's why we've moved this motion. And we think it's not difficult. The list is there. The Auditor General has it. The amount of money's had it. It's not as complicated as people say. They got the money under circumstances that weren't warranted, and it should be repaid.
I find it actually quite telling that we are receiving this surprise motion after the House has risen for the summer.
I just want to make sure Ms. Scalia has a lot to say on the motion at hand here that Mr. Perkins has put forward, and I want to respect that. I'm just wondering if we can confirm that resources will be available until what period of time to make sure Ms. Scalia can take the floor, express her thoughts on this, and the others that have their hand up can also get to this.
So I run the clock like a European soccer referee. Members are welcome to talk and talk and talk until we collapse for a vote or we run out of time. Ms. Khalid has the
floor. Sorry, Chair, I know that members of our team are asking if you're going to be bringing in dinner.
You know the answer to that.
Okay. I can share it off.
Point of order. Could we just make sure it's not $220,000 worth over 6 days, perhaps? And then we might be good.
And make sure it's not butter chicken, Chair.
We're out of resources. This meeting is adjourned.